The first time I knew something was wrong was not when the money disappeared from my account, but when I saw the way Clara smiled as she carried another branded shopping bag into the living room. It was the kind of smile that didn't ask for approval, it demanded it. I sat quietly at the edge of the couch, watching her twirl a leather strap between her fingers, like a child showing off a prize. My son Daniel walked in behind her, shoulders slouched, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he'd been dragged by an invisible leash. "Look at this, Dad," Clara said, holding up the bag. "Real Italian leather. Costs more than most people make in a month." Her laugh filled the room, light on the surface but sharp enough to cut skin. I forced a smile, but my stomach twisted. Something in her tone reminded me of the factory foreman who once shouted that I would never amount to more than a laborer. Except this time, the voice was inside my own home. I excused myself, retreating to my small room at the back of the house. There, on the old desk scarred with years of bills and letters, I opened my worn checkbook and compared the numbers against the bank statement I'd picked up that morning. The balance was smaller than it should have been, far smaller. My hands trembled as I traced the missing figures. I had counted those dollars as if they were grains of rice, saved from years of skipped meals and worn shoes, stacked coin by coin for the day when my body would no longer obey me. And now, almost all of it was gone. Later that evening, I confronted Daniel gently. He stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame like a boy too tired to stand on his own. "Son," I said quietly, "did you take money from my account?" He shook his head too quickly. "No, Dad. Clara. She's managing things. She says it's better if she handles the bills. You know, keeps things organized." "Organized," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. My gaze slipped past him into the glow of the kitchen, where Clara hummed as she unpacked bottles of expensive wine. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. He had the same habit when he was a boy, after breaking a neighbor's window with a stray ball looking anywhere but at me. But this was no broken glass. This was my life. I lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the fan cutting across the plaster like bars of a cage. I kept hearing her laugh, kept seeing Daniel's downcast face, kept feeling the weight of every hour I had bent my back in the sun, only to watch the fruit of it vanish into handbags and wine glasses. I realized then that this was not an accident. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. And in that silence, something inside me shifted not into anger, not yet, but into a cold certainty that this would not end here. Remember when I said that being underestimated can sometimes be your greatest weapon? That night was the first time I truly believed it. I used to believe that money was only paper, nothing more. But when I sat at the edge of my bed that next morning, holding the thin bank statement in my hands, it felt heavier than iron. Every figure on that page carried the weight of my past, the blistered palms from summer shifts at the mill, the nights I came home too tired to eat, the mornings I left before sunrise so Daniel could have a proper breakfast before school. Those dollars weren't just savings. They were my youth, my strength, my life traded away day after day, so I could give my family a future better than mine. And now, they had been turned into trinkets and wine glasses. I went to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only old neighborhoods carry. I saw a young father holding his boy's hand, walking toward the bus stop. For a moment I envied them. That boy looked at his father like he was the world. I remembered when Daniel used to look at me that way, clutching my calloused fingers like they were a shield. When did that change? When did I stop being his example and start being his burden? The memories pulled me back, as they always do. I remembered 25 years ago, when I had nothing but hope and a strong back. Daniel's mother had just passed, and people whispered that I'd never raise a child on my own. I proved them wrong. I worked any job I could find: carpenter, janitor, night watchman. I skipped meals so Daniel could eat. I stitched my shoes until they could not hold another thread, all so he could walk to school with his head held high. And each time I tucked a small bill into the old coffee tin that would become my savings, I whispered to myself, "This is for tomorrow. For him. For us." That tin turned into a bank account, and the account grew slowly but steadily, like a tree rooted in sacrifice. I never touched it for myself, not once. Vacations, luxuries, even medicine I sometimes skipped. I told myself it was all right as long as the money grew. Because one day, when my body betrayed me, that account would protect me. That was the promise I made to myself. And promises are sacred, especially when no one else knows you've made them. But standing there now with that statement in my hand, I felt something hollow open in my chest. I wasn't only betrayed by Clara's extravagance. I was betrayed by the years themselves, by the silent deal I had made with time. I gave up the best years of my life believing in tomorrow, and tomorrow had been stolen with a swipe of a card and the flash of a shopping bag. I sat back down at the table, folded the statement slowly, and pressed it flat with my palm. My reflection stared at me in the dark glass of the window, wrinkled, tired, but still alive. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, "If I could build this with nothing, I can protect it with everything I have left." What I didn't know then was that the battle ahead would not only be about money, it would be about dignity. And dignity, once taken, demands to be reclaimed. The house felt different after that morning. Not because anything had changed in the walls or the furniture, but because I could no longer look at them without wondering how long they would still be mine. Every picture frame, every chair, every shadow reminded me of the account that was shrinking while Clara's laughter grew louder. She moved through the house as if it belonged to her, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a drumbeat announcing ownership. Daniel stayed silent. He always stayed silent. I watched him one evening at the dinner table, his fork pushing food around his plate, while Clara described a new spa she had visited with her friends. She spoke with a kind of pride that burned me like she had achieved something great. "They said the package was worth more than $2,000, she said, smiling wide. Then she looked directly at me. "But you can't put a price on feeling young again, right?" Daniel chuckled weakly, his eyes fixed on his fork. I waited for him to defend me, to say something, anything. But the words never came. That silence told me more about his marriage than any confession ever could. He was living under her rules, and I was expected to nod along. I excused myself early from the table. In the hallway, I paused and looked back at them. Clara was laughing, pouring herself another glass of wine, while Daniel rubbed his forehead as if the weight of the world pressed there. My chest tightened. That was my son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy who trusted me to teach him right from wrong, and now he couldn't even lift his eyes to meet mine. In my room, I sat on the bed and let the stillness settle over me. I thought about the house itself, the one I had worked so long to keep. The cracked paint on the porch, the squeaky hinges on the front gate, the small garden out back that Daniel's mother used to tend with her soft hands. This place was never about luxury. It was about safety, about shelter, about the dignity of having a corner in this world that was truly ours. And now, even that felt fragile. I heard Clara's voice drift down the hall. She was on the phone, her tone sharp and playful. "Yes. I told him it's all handled. He has no idea how much I've taken out. Old people never notice those things. The sound of her laugh sliced through the walls like a blade. I sat there, my fists tightening on the sheets, but I didn't move. I let her words burn into me, branding themselves into my memory. Because silence has a strange power, it can crush you if you let it. Or it can harden you if you choose to endure. And in that moment I decided I would endure. I would watch. I would wait. Because sometimes the ones who think you are blind forget that your eyes are sharper in the dark. The humiliations began small, almost disguised as jokes. Clara had a way of saying things with a smile that cut deeper than shouting ever could. One afternoon she walked into the living room wearing a new gold necklace, its shine catching the late sunlight like a blade. She tilted her head and said, "Do you like it, Dad?" Daniel could never afford something like this on his salary, but thank God we have other resources. Her eyes lingered on me, daring me to respond. I only nodded, though inside I felt my chest hollow out. At family gatherings, she became bolder. Once, in front of my grandchildren, she laughed when I brought a homemade pie to the table. "Oh, how quaint," she said, her voice dripping with sugar, still baking like it's the only thing you can offer. "Kids, don't get used to this old-fashioned stuff. We can buy better at the store." The children laughed because they thought it was a joke, but I saw Daniel's eyes flicker with unease. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He just looked down and sipped his drink. I started noticing the whispers, too. Neighbors who had once respected me began exchanging looks. They had seen Clara arriving home in sleek cars, wearing dresses that shimmered in the evening light, carrying bags stamped with names most folks here couldn't even pronounce. When they asked her how she managed it, she would smile coyly and say, "Oh, we're just lucky. Daniel's father is generous. Aren't you?" Then she would laugh and pat my shoulder as though I were some kind of pet. Every time she did it, I felt myself shrinking, not because I believed her words, but because of the way others looked at me afterward like I was a fool, an old man too soft to notice what was being stolen right under his nose. That was the humiliation. Not just losing the money, but losing the respect I had spent a lifetime earning. I remember one night in particular. We were at the dinner table again, and Clara was sipping wine from a crystal glass she had ordered from Europe. She tapped the rim with her nail, smiling at Daniel. "You know, maybe we should renovate the whole house. Tear down this old furniture, make it modern. It's embarrassing to invite friends here when everything looks like it belongs to another century." Her eyes moved to me. "Don't you agree, Dad? It's time to let go of the past." I didn't answer right away. I looked around the table instead, at the worn chairs, the faded curtains, the wooden clock that had ticked in this house since the day Daniel was born. Each piece held a story, a sacrifice, a memory. Clara only saw junk. I saw my life. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost too calm. "The past built this house, Clara. Without it, you'd have no roof over your head." The silence that followed was sharp. She forced a smile, raised her glass, and said, "To new beginnings." Daniel clinked his glass against hers, though his eyes never left the table. That night, lying awake in the dark, I understood something painful. Humiliation wasn't just about being mocked. It was about being erased piece by piece, memory by memory, until you begin to wonder if you truly belong in the home you created. And I knew deep in my bones that if I didn't act soon, she would erase me completely. It was a Saturday afternoon when the truth stopped hiding behind smiles. Clara had invited 2 of her friends over. I stayed in my room, as I often did, because their laughter carried the kind of sharpness that made me feel like an uninvited guest in my own house. I was sorting through an old box of photographs when I heard her voice drift down the hallway. It was louder than usual, careless, as if she had forgotten I existed just a few feet away. "Can you believe it?" she said. The sound of a wine bottle, uncorking, punctuating her words. "All this luxury. And it isn't even my money. It's Daniel's father's. He doesn't even notice. Old men never do." Her friends laughed. A quick chorus of approval. One of them asked something I couldn't catch, and Clara's voice grew bolder. "Oh, it's easy. I have access to everything. He thinks I'm just paying bills, but I've been redirecting the funds for over a year now. Vacations, jewelry, handbags, you name it. And the best part? He actually thanks me for keeping things organized." The room erupted in laughter. I froze in place, my hands clutching a photograph of Daniel as a boy, missing teeth, but smiling like the world was his. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. The words replayed in my head like a cruel refrain. Old men never do. I set the photograph down, my hands trembling, and leaned closer to the doorway to hear more. One of her friends whispered, "Aren't you afraid he'll find out?" Clara's reply came quick, confident. "Find out? He's too soft, too trusting. Even if he did, what could he possibly do? He depends on us now. He won't risk losing Daniel. He wouldn't dare." Those words cut deeper than the money itself. To hear her speak of me, not as a father, not even as a man, but as a helpless burden, it was worse than theft. It was erasure. I pressed my fist to my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. Inside me, sorrow and fury twisted together like two storms colliding. For the rest of that afternoon, I sat in silence on the edge of my bed, listening to their laughter echo through the house that my hands had built, brick by brick, year by year. Each giggle was another nail sealing me into a coffin of humiliation. Yet beneath the sorrow, something else stirred. It wasn't anger alone. It was resolve. Clara thought I was blind, thought I was powerless. But she had forgotten one thing. I was still the man who had survived storms, who had raised a son alone, who had built a life from dust. And I wasn't done yet. That night, as the house quieted, and Clara's perfume still lingered in the air, I looked again at that photograph of Daniel as a boy. The smile was innocent, unspoiled, untouched by greed. I whispered to it like I was speaking to him across the years. "You may not defend me now, son, but one day, you'll see the truth, and so will she." What I didn't know then was that the silence I carried in that moment would become my greatest weapon, and that Clara's own arrogance would soon hand me the key to her undoing. After that day, I began to wear silence like a cloak. Clara thought her words had disappeared into the air, that I was deaf to her laughter and blind to her indulgence. She never noticed the way I lingered in doorways a second longer, the way my eyes followed her hands when she reached for Daniel's wallet or signed receipts in my name. She believed I had surrendered, but in truth, I was listening closer than ever. At breakfast, she slid a glossy brochure across the table, showing Daniel pictures of a beach resort. "We deserve this," she said, her tone as smooth as the silk robe she wore. Daniel glanced at me, waiting for a reaction, but I kept my face steady. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the spoon clink against the cup, as though the sound was all I cared about. Clara smiled. She mistook my silence for weakness. Inside, I recorded every word, every smirk, every boast. When Daniel kissed her cheek and left for work, She turned to me with that mocking sweetness she reserved. Just for me. You should rest more, Dad. Don't worry about finances. I'll take care of everything. I nodded, my lips pressed into a thin line. She walked away satisfied, humming some careless tune. That was when I understood. Silence disarmed her. She saw no threat in me, and that was my advantage. Each evening, when the house grew quiet, I sat at my desk with a worn notebook and wrote everything I noticed. The dates of her shopping trips, the times she left with credit cards that weren't hers, the words she carelessly threw to her friends over wine. The notebook became my memory's armor, a shield against her lies. On the outside, I was the aging man too tired to keep up with her pace. On the inside, I was a witness, quietly gathering the truth that would one day stand taller than her laughter. Still, there were nights when the silence cut deeper than her insults. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the plaster, hearing Daniel's voice as a boy calling me Dad with pride, not shame. I asked myself if staying quiet made me a coward. But then I remembered the storms I had survived before, the years of raising him with nothing but grit and prayer. I told myself patience was not cowardice. Patience was power. Clara thought she was clever, thought she had erased me with a swipe of a card and a cruel laugh. But the truth was, every time she underestimated me, she tightened the very rope she would one day trip over. I let her believe she had won. I let her think I was too frail to fight, because I knew that sooner or later, the mask she wore so proudly would slip, and when it did, I would be ready. What I could not imagine then was how quickly that chance would come, and how a single visit to the bank would tear away the last veil between suspicion and certainty. The decision to go to the bank came to me in the quiet of dawn. The house was still, Clara's perfume lingering faintly in the hall. Daniel gone early for work. I put on my old jacket, the one with worn elbows, and slipped the checkbook into my pocket. I walked down the street like I had done countless times in my younger years, when a trip to the bank was a moment of pride, a way to see the fruit of my labor grow. But this time my steps felt heavier, as though each one pressed down on the years of sacrifice that had brought me here. The teller recognized me. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she said, her smile polite, though I noticed the flicker in her eyes when she pulled up my account. I leaned on the counter, my hand trembling slightly from age but steady in resolve. "Could you print me the last year's statements?" I asked. She hesitated only for a second, then nodded, clicking her keyboard. The pages slid across the counter, warm from the printer. I picked them up with care, as if they might shatter in my hands. My eyes scanned the lines, numbers falling into place like stones dropping into water. Each withdrawal leapt off the page, thousands here, hundreds there. Week after week. Luxury stores, designer boutiques, resorts with names I could barely pronounce. I swallowed hard. Nearly all of it. Gone. I sank into a chair by the window, the papers trembling in my hands. The late morning sun cast its light through the glass, turning the ink into something almost cruelly clear. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a small theft. It was systematic, deliberate, like watching termites eat away at the beams of a house until only dust remained. Clara hadn't just taken money. She had taken years of my life, converted into handbags and champagne. The manager, a kind man named Robert, who had known me for decades, came over quietly. "Mr. Harris, are you all right?" His voice was soft, cautious, as though he already knew the answer. I forced a nod, my throat too tight for words. He sat beside me, lowering his voice. I've seen the activity. I didn't know how much you were aware. His eyes flickered with something that felt like pity. That stung more than the numbers. I never wanted pity. I wanted respect. I folded the papers carefully, slid them back into their envelope, and stood. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice low but steady. As I walked out of the bank, the city noise hit me like a wave. People bustled by, carrying groceries, laughing, rushing to jobs. None of them knew that in my hands, I carried the ruins of a lifetime. I paused at the corner, the weight of the envelope heavy in my pocket. The anger I expected didn't come. Instead, a quiet sorrow settled in, a mourning not for the money itself, but for what it represented: the sacrifices forgotten, the love twisted into entitlement, the years erased without a second thought. And as I turned toward home, clutching the truth in paper and ink, I realized this was no longer about numbers. This was about survival, dignity, and the line that had finally been crossed. I walked back home slowly, the envelope pressed against my chest as though it were a wound I was trying to keep closed. By the time I reached the porch, the weight of it had sunk deep inside me. I went straight to my room, sat down at the small desk where I'd once helped Daniel with his homework, and spread the papers out before me. Each line, each number, was a memory stripped bare. The savings weren't just money. They were the meals I skipped when Daniel was a boy so he could have meat on his plate. They were the winters I wore the same coat, patching it year after year, so I could put aside just a little more. They were the birthdays I went without gifts for myself, the Sundays I took double shifts instead of resting, the moments I told myself it was worth it, because one day, those sacrifices would protect me. Now those sacrifices had been poured into handbags, gold necklaces, vacations in places I would never see. I ran my hand over the pages, my fingers shaking, and I thought of Daniel's mother. She had always believed in saving for the future, even when we had almost nothing. Pennies turn into dollars, she used to whisper, as she tucked change into an old jar we kept hidden in the pantry. That jar was the beginning of what lay in front of me. She had trusted me to guard it, and I had guarded it with my life. But I hadn't guarded it from the one person I never thought I'd need to protect it from: my own family. I closed my eyes, and memories rushed in like a flood. The blistering heat of summer, shifts on construction sites, the cold steel of factory machines under my palms, the ache in my back that never truly left me. I remembered walking home in worn boots, counting the coins in my pocket, whispering to myself that it was enough. It had to be enough. All of that, every bead of sweat, every sacrifice, reduced to receipts for designer boutiques and champagne dinners. My chest tightened, and for the first time in years, I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. I pressed my palms against them, ashamed that Clara's greed had brought me to this point. The door creaked open slightly, and Daniel's voice broke the silence. "Dad, you all right?" I looked up at him, standing in the doorway with his shoulders hunched, his eyes avoiding mine. I wanted to hold up the papers, to thrust the truth into his hands, and demand to know how he could let this happen. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. He looked at me for a moment, then dropped his gaze. "Clara," she said, "she's handling things. It's better if you don't worry." His voice was small, hollow, and then he slipped away before I could reply. I sat there long after he left, staring at the papers, the silence in the room pressing heavy against me. That was when I understood. It wasn't only Clara who had betrayed me. It was Daniel's silence, his refusal to see, his unwillingness to stand beside me. That silence hurt more than the money. Because money can be earned again, but trust once broken turns to dust, and as I gathered the papers back into their envelope, my heart hardened. I knew then that what had been taken from me could never be given back. But what Clara and Daniel didn't know was that my silence had limits, and I had just reached them. That night the house felt colder than it should have. The heater was running, the lamps were lit, yet a chill settled into my bones that no blanket could warm. I sat in the living room, the envelope of bank statements resting on my lap like a stone. Daniel came home late, his tie loosened, his face pale. Clara trailed behind him, chattering about some new dinner reservation, waving her phone in the air, as if life were nothing but endless appointments for pleasure. She didn't even glance my way as she climbed the stairs. Daniel lingered, though. He looked at me, then at the envelope. And I could see in his eyes that he already knew what it contained. "Sit down," I said softly. My voice wasn't raised, but it carried enough weight that he obeyed. He sank into the chair across from me, his shoulders rounded like a boy about to be scolded. I laid the envelope on the coffee table between us and slid it toward him. "I went to the bank today." He didn't touch it. His hands stayed clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "Dad," his voice was low, almost pleading. "It's better not to stir things up." "Not stir things up?" My voice cracked before I steadied it again. "Daniel, your wife has drained nearly everything I saved in my life. Do you understand what that means? Every hour I broke my back, every dollar I tucked away. So you and your children could have a safety net, it's gone. And you want me to stay quiet?" He flinched, staring at the floor. I saw the boy in him again. The same boy who once hid behind me when the neighborhood kids were cruel. The boy who once believed I could fix anything. But now, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. "Clara. She's better at handling money. She says it's for the good of the family. You don't need to stress about these things." My chest burned. Not with anger alone, but with sorrow so sharp it felt like grief. "For the good of the family," I whispered. "What family is left when respect is gone? What good is luxury bought with betrayal?" Still, he wouldn't look up. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. He had chosen comfort over truth, silence over loyalty. And in that silence, I realized I wasn't only fighting Clara's greed. I was fighting Daniel's weakness, his refusal to stand by the man who raised him. I leaned back, my breath shaking, and for the first time in my life, I saw my son not as the boy I raised, but as a man who had turned away. The weight of that broke something inside me. I knew then that I could not rely on him to defend me. Whatever battle lay ahead, I would fight it alone. Daniel finally stood, his eyes still fixed on the ground. "Please, Dad. Just let it go." He walked up the stairs without waiting for an answer. I sat in the quiet, staring at the envelope, hearing Clara's laughter echo faintly from above. And in that hollow silence, one truth settled over me like stone. If I didn't act, no one would. That night, for the first time, I began to plan. The decision to reach out for help came slowly, like the tightening of a knot in my chest. I had spent my whole life believing a man should solve his own problems, that dignity meant carrying the weight without asking another to shoulder it. But that night, sitting alone with the envelope of statements, hearing Clara's laughter drift down from upstairs, I understood this fight was larger than me. I could not undo decades of sacrifice with silence. I needed someone who knew the law, someone who could see through the tricks of people who thought age made a man defenseless. I thought of an old friend, Martin Reyes, Years ago we had worked together at the mill, two young men sweating through endless shifts, dreaming of better days. While I stayed with the grind, Martin left to study law. Over the years, we lost touch, except for a Christmas card now and then. I still remembered his handwriting, bold and steady, signing his letters with the words, "If you ever need anything, call me." I had never taken him up on that offer. Until now. The next morning, with the sun still low and the streets quiet, I found his number written in the back of an old address book. My hand trembled as I dialed. When his voice answered older, deeper, but unmistakably Martin the First, almost lost my words. "It's Henry," I finally said. "Henry Harris. I think I need your help." There was a pause. Then warmth filled the line. "Henry, after all these years, tell me what's going on." I swallowed hard. "It's about my savings. Clara Daniels' wife, she's been draining it. Luxury, vacations, things I never agreed to. I have the papers, the proof, but Daniel won't stand up to her. He tells me to stay quiet." My voice cracked. "I can't, Martin. Not anymore." He didn't hesitate. "Bring me everything you've got. Don't say a word to them. Just come. We'll see what can be done." The relief that washed over me wasn't loud or sudden, it was quiet, like finally setting down a heavy load I'd carried too long. That afternoon, I took the bus across town, the envelope clutched in my hands. Martin's office was modest, tucked above a row of shops. But when I walked inside, the sight of him, gray hair, lines of age, etched deep into his face, but the same steady eyes brought me back to the days when we were young and unbroken by life. He greeted me with a firm handshake and sat me down. "Show me," he said simply. I spread the statements on his desk, the ink stark under the lamp. He leaned in, his brow furrowing as he read. Page after page, his jaw tightened. Finally, he looked up. "Henry, this isn't just mismanagement. This is exploitation. Elder financial abuse. If she's been signing or redirecting without consent, we have a case." The word case echoed in my mind like a bell. I had never imagined taking my own family to court, but here it was, laid bare. Betrayal had left me no other road. Martin tapped the papers with his finger. "We'll gather more evidence. We'll build this carefully. If she thinks she's untouchable, we'll remind her the law still speaks louder than arrogance." I nodded slowly, my throat thick with both gratitude and sorrow. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, Martin. Not against my own family." He sighed, his eyes softening. "Sometimes the people closest to us cut the deepest. But Henry, you've still got your strength. Don't let them take your dignity too." I left his office that evening with the folder clutched against my chest, the sky turning dark above the city. For the first time in months, the silence inside me wasn't just sorrow. It was the beginning of resolve. What Clara didn't know, what even Daniel didn't suspect, was that I had just taken the first step onto a path that would lead us all into a courtroom where lies could no longer hide behind laughter. From that day on, every moment became a quiet act of preparation. I returned home with the folder pressed to my chest, the weight of it heavier than any lunch pail I had ever carried in my working years. Clara didn't notice. She was too busy admiring herself in the mirror, holding up a new dress with the tag still dangling. "What do you think, Daniel?" she asked, twirling. "It cost a fortune. But don't I look like I'm worth it?" My son chuckled nervously. The same hollow sound he always made when he was trapped between pride and fear. I slipped past them unnoticed, which suited me fine. The less they saw of my eyes, the safer my thoughts remained. That night, after the house fell quiet, I pulled my old notebook from the drawer where I kept letters and photographs. I began writing down everything: dates, purchases, the names of stores, the times Clara came home with bags that bulged with things I knew she couldn't have bought on Daniel's salary alone. The pages filled with ink, my handwriting slower now, but no less determined. Each line was a small piece of truth, and truth was the only weapon I had left. The next morning, I went back to the bank. Robert, the manager, greeted me again, concern in his eyes. "Mr. Harris, I've prepared copies of the last 2 years, just as you asked." He slid a thick envelope across the counter. Inside were pages upon pages of transactions, each stamped with the cold clarity of numbers. I thanked him quietly, my voice low, but the look in his eyes told me he understood more than I said. "Keep this between us," I murmured. He nodded without hesitation. Loyalty still existed in some corners of this world. Over the following weeks, I added to the pile credit card bills with Clara's signature, receipts she had left crumpled in the trash, even photographs of items she flaunted in the house that I knew matched the charges. It was a strange kind of work, part detective, part historian. But I did it with the same patience I once used to fix broken fences or mend leaky roofs. Every detail mattered, and though my back ached and my eyes strained in the lamplight, I felt stronger than I had in months. Because I wasn't helpless anymore. I was building something. Quietly. In the shadows where Clara never bothered to look. One evening, as I folded another set of receipts into the folder, Clara breezed past my room. She stopped in the doorway, smiling with that saccharine sweetness. "Don't stay up too late, Dad. You'll tire yourself out. Leave the important things to us." She winked and vanished down the hall. I pressed my hand over the folder, my jaw tight, and whispered to myself, "One day, Clara. One day the important things will be out of your hands." And as the evidence grew thicker, my sorrow began to take on a new shape. It was still heavy, but no longer aimless. It was a weight I carried with purpose. Each paper I tucked into that folder was another step toward the moment when her arrogance would collide with truth, and the sound of it would echo in a courtroom. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of evening that used to be sacred in our house. When Daniel was a boy, Sundays meant family dinners, laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken filling the kitchen. But this Sunday was different. Clara had invited her friends again, and the table felt more like a stage than a home. I sat at the far end, my grandchildren beside me, their small hands reaching for bread, as Clara's laughter rang above us all. She wore another new necklace, the kind that glittered even in the dim light. "You know," she said loudly enough for the whole table, "it's such a shame Dad here never understood money. He saves and saves, but what does he have to show for it? Just this old house and his frugal little habits." She smirked, lifting her wine glass. "Meanwhile, I believe money is meant to be enjoyed. Don't you agree?" Her friends laughed, nodding, while Daniel stared at his plate, silent as always. My granddaughter, little Emily, looked up at me with wide eyes. "Grandpa, is it true you don't buy nice things because you're poor?" The innocence in her voice stung harder than Clara's words. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from anger alone but from the humiliation of being diminished in front of the very ones I had sacrificed for. I forced a smile for Emily. "Sweetheart, I've always believed the nicest things aren't bought in stores." She tilted her head, confused, before returning to her bread. Clara let out a sharp laugh. "See? Always with the riddles. He'll never admit he just doesn't understand how the world works." She clinked her glass against her friend's, the sound like a hammer against my dignity. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. I chewed without tasting, swallowed without hunger. I watched Daniel's silence, the way he let her words fill the room without once raising his voice to defend me. My heart ached, not just for myself but for him. What kind of man had my son become, that he could watch his father mocked and stay quiet? That silence was its own betrayal, and it cut deeper than Clara's cruelty ever could. After dinner, when everyone drifted into the living room, I lingered at the table, gathering plates slowly just to stay out of sight. I held the dishes in my hands and remembered the years when Daniel's mother used to sit across from me, her eyes soft, her presence grounding me. She would never have allowed such disrespect to enter our home, but she was gone, and I was left alone in this battlefield disguised as a family. I carried the plates to the sink, the clatter of porcelain masking the sound of my breath. Inside, sorrow pressed heavy against my chest. But beneath it, something else stirred. Clara thought she had humiliated me into silence. But what she didn't understand was that every insult, every smirk, every cruel word in front of my grandchildren was no longer breaking me. It was hardening me. That night, as I sat in my room with the folder of evidence, I whispered to myself, "One day soon, Clara, your laughter will echo in a place you least expect." And though the house outside was filled with her voice, inside me there was only one sound, the steady rhythm of resolve growing stronger with each beat of my heart. I didn't sleep that night. The echo of Clara's laughter still clung to the walls, like smoke you can't clear from a room. I sat at my desk with the folder open in front of me, the papers spread out like a map of betrayal. Every receipt, every statement, every note in my own shaky handwriting, they weren't just proof of what she had taken. They were reminders of what I had endured. I realized then that gathering evidence wasn't enough. I needed to put it in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. The next morning, I called Martin. His voice on the line was steady, carrying the weight of years but also the assurance of a man who had seen battles like this before. "Henry," he said, "bring everything. It's time we talk about what comes next." His office smelled faintly of old books and coffee when I walked in that afternoon. I laid the folder on his desk, pushing it toward him like an offering. He opened it slowly, adjusting his glasses, and began to read. The room grew quiet, except for the sound of pages turning. Every so often his brow furrowed, his lips pressing tighter. At last he leaned back, folding his hands together. "This isn't just carelessness, Henry," he said firmly. "This is exploitation. The law has a name for it. Financial abuse of the elderly. Courts take this seriously. If she's been spending without consent, if she's redirecting your money for personal gain, we have more than enough to act." I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. It's one thing to know the truth in silence. It's another to drag it into the light. She's my daughter-in-law, Martin, and Daniel. He'll be caught in the middle. Martin's eyes softened, but his tone didn't waver. "I know it hurts. But sometimes family is where betrayal hides deepest. You're not only protecting yourself, Henry, you're protecting your dignity. You have every right to fight back." He tapped the folder with his finger. "This will speak louder than her laughter ever could." He began outlining the steps, filing a formal complaint, notifying the bank to secure what little remained, preparing a petition to present before a judge. "We'll make this airtight," he promised. "She'll have no place to hide once it's in court." I sat there, listening, the words sinking in slowly. The thought of facing Clara in a courtroom made my stomach twist. But alongside the fear was a strange calm. For the first time, I wasn't only reacting, I was preparing. I was no longer a man cornered by humiliation. I was a man walking toward a fight I never wanted, but could no longer avoid. Before I left, Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. "Henry, she underestimates you. That's her mistake. Keep it that way. Act as you always have. Let her believe you're blind. The more she reveals, the stronger our case becomes." I walked out of his office with the city buzzing around me, the folder once again under my arm. The air felt sharper, the sky brighter. Clara thought she was safe behind my silence, that I had no voice left to raise. But what she didn't know was that silence, in the right hands, could be turned into a weapon, and soon enough, she would discover that the laughter she used to mock me would be the very sound that condemned her. From that day forward, I wore silence like a mask, careful never to let it slip. Martin's words echoed in my mind. "Keep acting as you always have. Let her believe you're blind." And so I did. I nodded when Clara bragged about her new purchases, forced a smile when she waved receipts under my nose, and shuffled out of the room when her laughter stung too much. She saw only an old man too weary to understand, a shadow fading in the corner of her world. What she didn't see was the notebook in my drawer, growing heavier each night, the folder of evidence swelling thicker, the resolve in my chest hardening into stone. One evening she came home with Daniel trailing behind her, his arms weighed down with boxes, designer shoes, a handbag, perfumes that cost more than a month's wages, all spilled onto the couch as she tore them open, squealing with delight. "You see, Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with triumph. "This is what it means to live well. Not like your father with his pennies and patched jackets." She turned toward me, her lips curling into a smile. "No offense, Dad. But times have changed." Daniel laughed nervously, setting another box on the floor. His eyes flicked toward me for only a moment, as though checking if I'd protest. I didn't. I simply lifted my newspaper higher, pretending to read while my ears caught every word. Silence was my shield, and Clara mistook it for surrender. She didn't know silence could also be a trap. At family gatherings, her arrogance grew louder. "We're planning another trip," she boasted to her friends, over dinner. "Somewhere better this time, first class, of course. It's amazing what you can afford when you know how to manage money." Her gaze lingered on me, sharp and taunting. I only chewed slowly, meeting her eyes with the calm of a man who had weathered storms she couldn't imagine. The silence unnerved her for a moment, I could tell. But then she smirked and lifted her glass. "To living life to the fullest," she declared. Her friends cheered, and Daniel raised his glass too, though he looked pale beneath the light. Later that night, as I passed their room on the way to mine, I overheard Clara on the phone. Her voice was high, almost giddy. "He hasn't got a clue," she said. "I could empty every account tomorrow and he still wouldn't know. Old men don't fight. They just fade away." Her words were meant for someone else, but they sank deep into me like nails. I gripped the folder tighter against my chest as I walked to my room. Fading away was not in my nature. Not then. Not ever. In the quiet of my room, I sat at the desk and added the new receipts I had collected, each one another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. Every stroke of my pen was steady, deliberate, fueled by the knowledge that her arrogance was giving me exactly what I needed. She thought she was untouchable, but in truth, she was handing me the rope with which she would be bound. And as I closed the notebook that night, a strange calm settled over me. The game was hers for now, but the ending, oh, the ending would be mine. She just didn't know it yet. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. It carried no perfume, no glittering logo of a boutique, nothing of the world Clara had wrapped herself in, just a stamp, a seal, and a weight far heavier than she could have imagined. I found it first, slipped through the mail slot, and when I turned it over in my hands, I knew exactly what it was. The court had spoken. Her name was on it now, not just mine. I placed the envelope carefully on the hallway table and waited. Clara breezed down the stairs an hour later, still in her robe, coffee cup in hand. She glanced at the pile of letters, spotted the envelope with her name printed in bold, and frowned. "What's this?" she muttered, tearing it open with casual annoyance. But the moment her eyes scanned the words inside, the color drained from her face. Her hand froze mid-air, the coffee trembling. Daniel noticed. "Clara? What is it?" He reached for the paper, but she snatched it back, her lips tightening. "It's nothing," she said quickly, shoving the letter into the pocket of her robe. "Just some paperwork." She tried to smile, but her voice cracked on the edges. I watched from my chair in the corner, the newspaper held loosely in my hands. For once, it wasn't me hiding behind silence. It was her. She avoided my gaze, as though the weight of my eyes could expose the truth she was desperate to keep. But the silence between us told Daniel more than any words could. His brow furrowed, suspicion flickering across his face, though he stayed quiet, too afraid of what answers might come. Later that day, I heard her pacing in the bedroom upstairs, the floor creaking with every nervous step. Her voice hissed into the phone, sharp and urgent. "Yes. I received it. No. He doesn't know. Don't tell me to calm down if this goes to court." Everything could unravel. Each word was a confirmation of what I already knew. The arrogance that once made her boast to her friends had turned to fear, and fear has a sound you cannot mistake. At dinner, her smile was forced, her appetite gone. She pushed food around her plate and tried to speak of trivial things, but her eyes darted toward me again and again, as if I had placed the summons there myself. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Silence had become my ally, and it was louder now than her laughter had ever been. When the children asked her what was wrong, she excused herself, rising from the table with hurried steps. Daniel looked after her, then turned to me, confusion etched in his face. I only lowered my eyes to my plate, the faintest trace of calm settling over me. For the first time, in a long while, it wasn't me being erased. It was her certainty that was beginning to disappear. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the years I had swallowed insults, of the countless nights I had pretended not to hear her laughter. Now the tables had turned. The law had called her name, not mine. And no handbag, no necklace, no glass of wine could erase the sound of it. What Clara didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The courtroom still waited. And in that place, truth had a way of stripping away every mask. The morning of the hearing arrived, gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to lean down on the world. I woke before dawn, though I hadn't truly slept. My hands trembled slightly as I buttoned the same navy jacket I'd worn to Daniel's graduation decades ago. It was worn at the edges, but it still carried a dignity I wanted with me in that room. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not only the wrinkles and the tired eyes of an old man, but also the quiet strength of someone who had survived too much to bow his head now. Martin met me at the courthouse steps. He was steady, professional, but his hand on my shoulder lingered, reminding me I wasn't walking in alone. Together we entered the building, the echo of our steps swallowed by high ceilings and marble floors. The air smelled faintly of dust and polished wood, like history itself lingered in the walls. I clutched the folder to my chest, the papers inside rustling faintly, as if whispering courage back to me. When Clara arrived, she was almost unrecognizable. She wore a sleek dress, her hair carefully done, makeup flawless. To anyone else, she looked confident, but I saw what others didn't. The tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the strap of her purse too hard. She glanced at me once across the corridor, and for the first time, I saw her look away first. It was a small thing, but it gave me breath. Daniel walked beside her, shoulders hunched, his eyes flickering nervously between us. He didn't greet me. He didn't even attempt to smile. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, like a man caught in a storm of his own making, unsure which way to turn. I wanted to reach for him, to remind him he was still my son. But the moment passed. The bailiff called us inside, and we took our seats. The courtroom was quiet, but the silence carried weight. The judge entered, his robe flowing, his expression grave. When he spoke, his voice filled the room like a bell. "We are here to hear the matter of financial exploitation, with evidence presented by Mr. Henry Harris." My name rang out, steady and formal. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I sat taller, my hands folded on the table before me. Martin began by laying out the facts, one by one. He presented the bank statements, the receipts, the dates. His voice was measured, clear, each word, like a stone, placed firmly on a foundation. The judge listened without interruption, his eyes moving from Martin to me, then to Clara. She shifted in her seat, her confidence thinning with every page placed on the record. When Clara's lawyer rose to speak, his tone was slick, polished. He tried to paint me as forgetful, as a man too old to manage his own finances. "Surely, Your Honor," he said, "this is a misunderstanding of family arrangements. My client has only ever acted in the household's best interest." But when the judge asked Clara directly about specific transactions, her answers faltered. Her voice cracked when confronted with her own signature on receipts that matched charges against my account. I sat still, my heart pounding. But I didn't speak. Not yet. My silence was no longer the silence of weakness. It was the silence of a man who knew his turn would come. And as the session drew toward my testimony, I felt the room grow smaller, the air heavier. Soon it would be my voice. My chance to speak the truth not only for myself, but for every hour of labor, every sacrifice that had been turned into someone else's pleasure. I could feel it rising inside me, the words I had held back for too long. What Clara and even Daniel didn't yet realize was that once I began to speak, there would be no taking it back. When the judge finally called my name, the room seemed to still. I rose slowly, my legs stiff but steady, and walked to the front. The wooden floor creaked beneath my shoes, each step reminding me of the weight I carried, not just paper and numbers, but years of sacrifice. I placed my hand on the railing, felt the polished wood beneath my palm, and looked at the judge. His eyes were firm but not unkind. "Mr. Harris," he said, "tell us what you know." For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. My throat tightened. My heart thudded in my chest, like it wanted to escape. Then I thought of the nights I had skipped meals so Daniel could eat, the mornings I left before dawn to put away just a few more dollars, the evenings when Clara's laughter rang in my ears like a cruel echo, and the words came. "I worked my whole life," I began, my voice low but clear. "I started with nothing. Every dollar I earned, I set aside little by little. Not for myself, but for my family. For a future. That money, I gestured to the papers on the desk, isn't just numbers in an account. It is the roof over our heads, the food on our table, the clothes on my son's back when he was growing up. It is my life's work, turned into savings, and I never gave permission for it to be spent on vacations or handbags or restaurants I could never afford. The judge nodded, signaling for me to continue. I opened the folder, pulled out a statement, and held it up. This is a charge to a luxury store. My name is on the account. My money paid for it. But I never bought these things. I never agreed to it. Week after week, month after month, the account was drained while I was told not to worry, that everything was being handled. I glanced at Clara. Her face was pale, her jaw tight, but her eyes flickered when I met them. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I held her gaze only long enough to let her know I wasn't afraid, then turned back to the judge. I may be old, Your Honor. I may not have a head for modern ways, but I am not blind. I am not forgetful. I know what I worked for, and I know when it has been taken. Martin stepped forward then, laying more documents on the table. Your Honor, these are bank records signed by the defendant. Each transaction matches the purchases Mr. Harris has just described. The judge leaned closer, adjusting his glasses, and the silence in the room grew heavy. Every shuffle of paper sounded like a hammer, striking wood. The defense lawyer tried to object, but the judge cut him off. Sit down, he said firmly. Then he looked back at me. Mr. Harris, is it your testimony that you did not authorize any of these expenditures? I drew in a breath, steadying myself. Yes, Your Honor. Not a single one. The words landed like stones, solid and undeniable. For the first time, the balance in the room shifted. It was no longer me who seemed small. It was Clara, shrinking into her chair, her confidence unraveling under the weight of evidence and truth. As I stepped back to my seat, my knees weak but my heart strong, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the taste of air after being held underwater. The battle was only beginning, but I could see, in the way Clara gripped her lawyer's arm, that the first blow had already landed. The judge turned his gaze toward Clara. Mrs. Harris, he said, his tone firm. You may respond. The words seemed simple enough, but in the silence that followed, they carried the weight of a gavel. Clara shifted in her seat, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. For a woman who had once filled every room with laughter and confidence, her voice now sounded thin. Your Honor, I was only trying to help manage things. Daniel works long hours, and his father, well, he isn't good with numbers. I thought it was better if I handled the accounts. Martin leaned forward before she could continue. Handled them? He said sharply. Or emptied them? Your signature is on these receipts. Can you explain why a handbag costing more than 2 months of Mr. Harris's pension appeared as a charge on his account? Clara's lawyer jumped in quickly. Objection. This line of questioning is overruled, the judge interrupted. His eyes returned to Clara. Answer the question. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Daniel as if searching for support. But Daniel's gaze was fixed on the table, his face pale. Clara's lips parted. It was a gift, she stammered. For me. Daniel approved it. She reached for his arm. Didn't you, honey? Daniel didn't move, didn't even raise his head. The silence between them spoke louder than any denial. Martin stepped closer to the bench, his voice steady. Your Honor, We also have records of international travel booked under her name, first-class tickets paid directly from Mr. Harris's account. Does she also claim those were gifts? He held up the documents, the ink stark against the paper. Clara's hands trembled as she glanced at them. Her lips moved, but no words came. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Harris, do you understand what is being alleged here? This is not about gifts. This is about consent. Did your father-in-law authorize you to spend his money on these purchases? The room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara finally whispered, "No, not directly." The words slipped out. So soft, she seemed to regret them the moment they left her lips. But they were enough. The crack had appeared in her mask, and the truth was beginning to seep through. Martin nodded slightly, then addressed the court. Your Honor, the defendant has just admitted she did not have direct consent. That is, the very definition of exploitation. The judge scribbled notes, then looked back at Clara. This is serious. You will have a chance to explain further. But understand, excuses do not erase signatures, and laughter does not cover theft. Clara sat rigid, her face drained of color, her eyes finally lifting to meet mine. For the first time since this nightmare began, she did not smirk, did not gloat, did not look past me as if I were invisible. She looked at me and saw what she had never expected, an old man who had found his voice, and whose silence had now turned into evidence. I lowered my eyes, not out of weakness, but out of pity, because I knew this was only the beginning of her unraveling, and the truth waiting just ahead would strike harder than any words I had spoken that day. The final day of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire courthouse. I sat at the long wooden table beside Martin, my hands folded, my breath slow. Clara sat across from me, her face pale despite the layers of makeup she had painted on. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, sliding papers toward her, but she only stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. Daniel sat a step behind her, his shoulders bent, his eyes fixed on the floor as though looking down might spare him from the weight of what was about to come. The judge entered, his robe sweeping across the floor, and the room fell into silence. He shuffled the papers before him, then adjusted his glasses. We have reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the records, he began, his voice steady, carrying no trace of emotion. This case is not about misunderstandings. It is about trust, and whether that trust was abused. He lifted one of the bank statements, holding it between his fingers. The account in question belonged solely to Mr. Henry Harris. The funds deposited were his earnings, saved over many years. The withdrawals, however, show a pattern of expenditures that clearly benefited Mrs. Clara Harris without documented consent. He lowered the paper slowly. The defendant herself admitted under oath that she did not have direct authorization. That alone is sufficient for this court. I felt my chest tighten as the words sank in. For months I had carried silence, humiliation, and sorrow like stones in my pocket. Now, here, each stone was being lifted, one by one. The judge's gaze moved to Clara. This court finds you responsible for the misappropriation of Mr. Harris's savings. You are hereby ordered to repay the sum, with interest, and restitution will be pursued in full. Furthermore, a formal notice will be placed on the record regarding financial exploitation, ensuring this cannot be hidden from future scrutiny. Clara's breath caught sharply, a sound halfway between a gasp and a cry. She gripped the table, as though it might keep her from falling. For the first time, she had no laughter, no excuses, only silence. The judge's voice grew firmer. This is not only about money. It is about dignity. To take advantage of someone who has built a life through sacrifice is not only unlawful, it is shameful. This court will not tolerate it. Martin leaned closer to me, his whisper steady. We did it, Henry. But I hardly heard him. My eyes were on Daniel. He finally looked up, his face pale, his lips trembling. For a moment our eyes locked. Father and son, two men bound by blood, but torn apart by silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He only lowered his head again, his shame heavier than any sentence the judge could give. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The verdict was done. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been served. As I stood to leave, the weight in my chest shifted. The money could be returned, the papers filed, the law recorded. But what had been lost in trust, in respect, in family, that could never be written back into existence? I walked toward the door, each step steady, my heart heavy, with the knowledge that winning in court was not the same as winning at home. And yet, as I placed my hand on the wooden door to leave, I knew this was not the end. Because victory in the courtroom was only one part of the story. The harder part would be facing the silence waiting for me when I returned home. The days after the verdict moved slowly, as if the world itself needed time to catch its breath. I returned home with the official papers tucked into my jacket. But the house no longer felt the same. The laughter that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by a heavy quiet that clung to every wall. Clara avoided me, moving quickly from one room to another like a shadow trying not to be seen. Her heels no longer clicked with arrogance. They whispered across the floor, uncertain, fragile. And Daniel, my son, kept his distance. He lingered outside, came home late, and when he did sit in the same room, he spoke little. His eyes haunted. I sat in my chair by the window, the same spot I had sat for years. But now the view looked different. The trees swayed as they always had. Children played in the street. The postman walked his route. The world carried on, indifferent to battles won or lost. I thought about the money, how it would return in time, how the bank would restore what was left of my savings. But I also thought about what could never be restored. The warmth of family dinners, the respect of a son who once looked at me with pride, the quiet trust that once held this house together like mortar between bricks. One evening, little Emily came to sit by me. She carried a book in her hands and climbed onto my lap as she used to when she was smaller. "Grandpa," she whispered, "why doesn't Mom laugh anymore?" I held her close, my throat tightening. How could I explain that laughter built on lies will always vanish once truth takes its place? I stroked her hair gently and said only, "Sometimes people forget what's important, sweetheart. But we mustn't forget. We must always remember to choose kindness, even when others don't." Her small head nodded against my chest, and in that moment I felt something stir in me. Not bitterness, not anger, but a quiet resolve. The court had given me back my dignity on paper, but it was up to me to show my grandchildren what dignity looked like in life. Not revenge, not cruelty, but standing firm even when the people closest to you falter. Later that night, when the house was silent and the moonlight spilled across the floor, I opened my old notebook. I ran my fingers over the pages filled with dates, receipts, and notes, evidence that had carried me through the fire. Then I closed it gently and set it aside. It had served its purpose. The fight was over, at least in the courtroom. But in my heart, I knew the struggle for healing would last far longer. I looked around the room, the walls lined with memories, and whispered into the quiet, "I survived this storm. I will survive the silence too." Because dignity, once reclaimed, is something no one can take again. And though Clara's laughter was gone, and Daniel's silence cut deeper than words, I knew this was not the final chapter. For the story of a family never ends in court, it continues in the quiet spaces, where forgiveness might take root, or where distance might grow forever. Only time would decide which path we would walk.